Welcome everybody to the 6th edition of The Great Debate, the UK's annual public debate about design and society, part of the 7th annual Design Manchester Festival, which is now in full swing, as you know, with more than 40 events in great locations around the city this week and next. If you want to blow your mind with the latest cutting edge and best in design, you'll want to be at our international conference with great speakers and immersive workshops at the Bridgewater Hall Friday next week. The details are on our website. Now this year, to help us understand our audiences better, we are running a survey, which we urge you to take part in. Not only urge actually, but bribe. When you go to designmanchester.com, designmcr.com/survey, you will be invited to enter our prize draw, and the lucky winner gets a signed original print donated by Swifty himself, and 6 tickets to next year's international conference. So do please help us and take part in the survey, once you've figured out how brilliant this particular event is, of course. Now, our first debate in 2014 was about the Northern Powerhouse. That was then a brand new topic. More specifically, it was about the role of design in the creative industries as an engine of growth. Now, the next year, we headed to the Whitworth Gallery to debate the value of design, both economically and socially. And then, in 2016, as some of you will recall, still smarting from the Brexit referendum, we tackled city identity in the bonded warehouse at the Old Granada Studios with mayoral candidate Andy Burnham. Then 2 years ago, we were back here to discuss the public realm. And last year, we talked about the havoc wreaked by Michael Gove as Education Secretary. You realize it's not the BBC, so we don't have to be impartial here. Taking as our starting point a well-known slogan by the artist Bob and Roberta Smith: all schools should be art schools. Speaking of which, I would like to say a very special welcome to Penny Macbeth, the Dean of the School of Art, to say a couple of words.
Hi, thank you. Welcome everyone. Really glad to welcome you here tonight on behalf of Manchester Metropolitan University to our wonderful Manchester School of Art. And if you haven't had a look round, do have a look round either today or another day. There's some amazing exhibitions up here at the moment as part of Design Manchester. Design Manchester is really important to us in the School of Art. It's a really important part of Manchester's cultural ecology. I think the Great Debate is a really significant highlight of Manchester's year, and I'm sure it'll be a wonderful evening tonight. And we have a great panel here to discuss livable cities. We're very excited this week because in this part of Manchester, next to this building, we've just finished the piling work for our new School of Digital Arts. And so that means we're well on track and working very quickly now to develop that building, which will open in September 2021. So we're evolving and changing along with Manchester as it evolves and changes, and we're very excited about that. So have a wonderful evening, and I'll catch up with you after. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much indeed, Pat. I actually want to say a special thank you to the School of Art, which is our founding partner as a festival. Of course, hosting the debate this year, as well as our fantastic Paula Scher exhibition, which you can see on the wall outside to the left, and actually throughout the rest of the building. And also, in the foyer outside, is a pop-up exhibition of The Ideal City, a collaboration between Manchester School of Art, Hong Kong Design Institute, and Design Council, which you'll be able to peruse over a drink later on. I also want to thank our festival partners and sponsors, that's Manchester City Council, Mayfield, the University of Salford, Papermakers GF Smith, Anna Money, and Arts Council England. Our subject this year is what makes a livable city. Last year, we launched the Manchester Design Manifesto as a partnership between the City Council and the design community. Earlier this year, the City of Manchester signed a cultural partnership with Aarhus and Aalborg, the 2nd and 4th largest cities in Denmark, respectively. This year, we are starting an international dialogue about the role of design in cities, in partnership with the Danish Embassy, the cities of Aarhus and Aalborg, Manchester City Council, Manchester Society of Architects, Manchester School of Architecture, and the Design Council. The Liveable City Conference at Mayfield next week will tackle some of the key challenges, and it should be informed by our debate this evening. So don't hold back, please, on expressing views that should be heard by city leaders, planners and architects from all three cities. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our stellar panel. First up, we have someone who knows what he's talking about when it comes to designing with the community. That's Ben Young, creative principal of Community Designers Standard Practice, who in a previous incarnation as OOK Limited, built the Pilcrow pub in Noma with members of the community. One of the key challenges that we have in cities everywhere, and particularly in the UK, is housing. So it's a really great pleasure to welcome the architect Joe McCafferty, director of Levitt Bernstein, who has co-authored the brilliant Housing Design Handbook, which anybody interested in the future of housing would love to have. Cities are complex. They're made up of many communities facing different challenges, and that's something that we would do really well to bear in mind when talking about livability. And for that reason, I'm really delighted that on our panel we have an icon of Manchester, the peace campaigner Erin Mabel, who established the South Manchester community charity Charisma in Moss Side. Many of us have seen the sculpture of Erin in Manchester Central Library, but we are lucky enough to have her here in the flesh and ready to give us a piece of her mind. The next person on our panel has more than once been described, in fact, at the end of the table, as a rock star of city architecture to me. And that's Stephen Willisey. Yes, it's you. Yes, I've skipped Pat, I'm sorry. Stephen Willisey, the chief city architect of Aarhus in Denmark. Stepping one back, but I would say that before going on about Pat, who I've known for many years, I want to just say that in an interview with Stephen in Rotterdam, which was published only 2 days ago, he talks about his general obsession with second cities and his belief in making decisions together with residents. This ability of cities to learn by looking through each other's eyes is central to the dialogue that we're trying to create, and so I'm delighted that Stephen is with us this evening. And finally, and I'm sorry I got it slightly the wrong order, but I'm really privileged to welcome a woman who has had a great and beneficial impact on many cities, including London and New York. Pat Brown, director of the Place Consultancy Central, and among many other things, development vice chair of the British Property Federation. Pat inspired the world's largest pedestrian wayfinding system in London with the simple premise that she wanted people to be able to explore cities because they had the confidence to get lost. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel. And so we go to our first question, and I'd like to ask John Owens.
So on the subject of what makes a livable city, who's this livable for? Who do we need to think of to make our cities livable?
Who are livable cities for? Is it people who come and visit from places far and wide? Is it people who live here? What kind of people? Irma, maybe you'd like to tackle that one first.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, because this is something you said while you were introducing. Sorry, good evening, everybody, again. The role of designing cities. You know, I think when they're designing things in cities, local community people should be involved, because I think it's we that are going to actually live there or move about in that city, mostly. It's not, I think the cities, yes, people visit and come and go, but I think in the main, I think who they're for is for the people that are actually going to be living there. So cities need to be livable. We need to be able to live in those with our families. We need to be able to create communities in those spaces, because I feel, I mean, in today's society, we don't have the communities what we used to have, and I think that's mainly to do with the way housing is built. Sorry, who was from housing? You know, the way housing's built. They kind of like divide people up. We're not actually closer. You know, the bricks and the mortar that are between us have become even more bricks and mortar, so it doesn't encourage people to actually, you know, come together. Who do we need to think of? I think I've answered that. It's the people that are actually going to live there, which I think is local, you know, grassroots, people who are actually going to be there all the time. Those are the people that we need to think of. We need to think about how the people living there, how they will grow, how they will change, i.e. families and families to come.
Okay, Joe, could you, I mean, we will probably talk a bit more about housing in a moment, but on the general point of who should livable cities be livable for?
Well, I think what I would say is that I think our current experience is that actually cities at the moment many cities don't function well for families. And something that, in fact, Pat and I are working on at the moment is looking at how cities function for children and thinking about how open space and green space within cities can function through the eyes of a child and how they work for all ages. The other thing I would also say is that cities often don't function for the elderly. And so how you bring both extremes in terms of ages together within communities is incredibly important. So I would absolutely echo your point about the way housing is designed quite often increasingly is quite siloed. And what we need to try and introduce in our housing is much more flexibility so that it works for future generations, for generations, rather than for a very specific sector of society for 5 or 10 years.
Stephen, maybe I could ask you on this question. I went over to Aarhus and Aalborg earlier in the year, and we had conversations about the differences and similarities between our cities. Manchester is a really, really diverse city with lots of different types of groups in the population and lots of different social groups. And in Aarhus and Aalborg, there's maybe less of the same type of diversity, and I wonder in what way this question of social inclusion and who cities have to be livable for, in what way that is the same and in what way it's different over in Denmark.
Well, I'm glad you asked the question because I was thinking of talking about it in those terms. Firstly, though, I would like to say that this whole idea of livable cities, you've got the magazines like Monocle,
Yes.
who do these standards and decide who's the top 10 or top 50 livable cities. And it becomes a marketing thing. You know, Copenhagen's there, Vancouver's there, or, you know, these big cities. Aarhus is not there because they're not big enough. And, you know, I'm saying to Monocle, we're much more livable, we're just as livable as a city like Copenhagen. It's just you've got to get your head out your asses and come and see us because we've got a lot going on, and in Aalborg and places. Now, back to the question is that the complexity of the city is in its people. And we have challenge housing districts, lots of them. We have communities, the city council, the area itself has lots of adjacent towns in the countryside, villages and small towns of 10,000 people. And we have an inner city where there's, within the ring road, there's 50% of the population are students. And they're only there for 3 years, maybe, whilst the other remainder are living there constantly. And so there's the complexity of the type of users and the people in the cities is very interesting. And we have to adjust all the time to where we are in the city doing the projects and how we engage with them. And that's one of the big challenges, I think, is it's the way you engage. Because all these variable groups have different needs. And I think we have you know, in the council, I think we have almost one model that fits all. Primarily because it's easier to work like that. But I'm finding that, you know, working with the citizens, there's a certain group that come to the meetings. I'm not going to say usual suspects, but something like that. And they have the same colour hair as you and I. And they've got more time, but there's no families coming there and what have you. So there's lots of different layers in this. Yes. And although Manchester's much bigger than Aarhus, we're second cities, the degree of complexity are similar because we're facing the same challenges, I think. And that's why I think it's very good to participate in such events, is this you know, transfer of knowledge and sharing ideas across the table like this. It's fantastic. Thank you for that.
And looking through each other's eyes.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what we hope to build on. That's really great. Thank you, Stephen. So in terms, is that what we develop who do we develop our cities for, Pat?
Thank you. Great to be here. That's such a, you know, that's a sort of a PhD topic in a way, that question you've asked. And I want to go back to what I started to do about 20 odd years ago, which was when we kicked off what became Legible London. I ran a public-private partnership called Central London Partnership, and we put together an action plan for Central London to work out what we could do to make it continue to be a really successful world city. And what we said pretty much for the first time ever when you were bringing senior level people together was we talked about commuters, and we talked about tourists, and we talked about visitors and people going out at night, but we didn't actually talk about people. We talked about what they did, not as them as a group of people, and we'd planned for cars as opposed to people. And I've, throughout my past 25 years, had at the back of my mind something I heard Anita Roddick say 25 years ago, which is we advertised for employees, but people came along instead. And I think that's a really a profound thing that Anita said, and I've kept it under my hat ever since, because it's really easy, even in your question, your very simple question, to forget it's all about people. And to Stephen's point, we're all different and we all have different needs. And that is really, for me, the crux of the issue is what are our needs? And challenging what I call the people like us syndrome, because I sit in a room with predominantly white, middle-class people making decisions about what London needs and what it looks like in the future, but critically, what is going to be in those places. And where I live, I don't have access, even in core central London, to a supermarket. I have 28 Tesco Metros, Sainsbury's Local and Marks and Spencer's little mini supermarkets, but I don't have anywhere where I can shop, because somebody has made a decision that I and people like me don't need a supermarket. So you said look through each other's eyes. I say walk in each other's shoes and think what it's like to be a family of two children trying to get on a bus in the rain, when the buses are busy, to get to the child to nursery, to go to work afterwards, and plan our cities for people like that and many other people like us. And that means a deep dive, and not just engagement, but a social anthropological look at the way we live our lives.
Thank you very much. Now, before I ask Ben, I just want to say this, that this is our great debate. This is our public debate about design and society. And the great value of a public debate is that we have the opportunity for us all to debate things and to express views. So you are strongly encouraged to ask your questions, make your points of view clear, speak, participate in the debate just as much as the panel. So if you feel the urge, please stick your hand up and you're very welcome to speak. And I'll just give you notice, if you have possibly a question forming in your mind, you can have it ready for after Ben tells us from a community perspective. This thing about who it's for, I think we're all saying, well, it's for everybody, but how do you actually do that, Ben?
Well, I'm really pleased that we've already mentioned families, because I've got a 2-year-old at the moment. I live in the middle of central Manchester, and I'm currently at that point where I'm sort of resisting the pull to Manchester suburbs, where we might have more green space and we might have places to learn to ride a bike and all of the things that should happen in Manchester city centre. So that is something that I feel really, really strongly about. But the work we do is based around trying to empower members of the public to feel like they have a bit more agency in the cities that they live in. We're really passionate about trying to build community spaces where members of the public can assemble and group together and congregate. And I think unless we're working to deliver those, then we can't be delivering a city for everybody, because without members of the public and normal citizens, cities become just property investments. And
but that's the interesting thing, isn't it? That it's what you've been doing is you have been building and developing with people. so with
Yeah.
the community. And you've also learned from doing the Pilcrow pub some of the things that you felt, you know, you didn't do right and you were too prescriptive. You wanted
I
to
guess
become
so,
more-
yeah. So what we started out doing is trying to deliver workshop facilities, places where people come on and make things with us. We were quite interested in empowering members of the public to feel like they could make stuff.
Yeah.
And that's really not what people want at all, it turns out. What people want is space to assemble, spaces to congregate, places to gather. So we started to push our workshop facilities and the places for making to the corners, and we're just creating clearings really in the city centre where that can be populated by activity that we weren't anticipating at all. I think that's a much more effective way of.
Very interesting. Creating space and opportunity for things to happen.
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions from the audience at this juncture? Yes, over here, Jonathan. Thanks. If you say your name when you ask a question.
Hello? Yes. My name's Cathy Barlow. You touched on green spaces. I think this is so important in a city where people have a massive disconnect with the natural environment, which we know gives us so much sense of grounding and well-being. And this is something that's very much missing, especially in a city like Manchester, which is so congested, so built up. How can we introduce more green spaces for people to use and have those places where they can congregate and enjoy and get back to seeing trees and things like this?
Yes, green and open spaces, a major challenge for Manchester. Well, as it's specifically a Manchester question, maybe Irma, do you have a view on that?
I mean, I love the green space, and I suppose we're quite lucky. We live right in front of a park.
Can you hear everybody? Or,
Okay,
yeah.
sorry.
Sorry.
I suppose I was going to say I love green spaces, and I suppose we're quite lucky that we live right in front of a park, and we always have done since I was, a young child. So we're quite used to it. I mean, a couple of times, or when I say a couple of times, we have thought of moving because it's our family home. So our family, we have thought of moving, but every time we've looked at somewhere, there's not enough green space, so we've stayed. But I think it's going to be probably difficult to create more green space. But I think what we could do is encourage people to use the green spaces that we have. I once heard how many parks we've got in Manchester, and I can't remember the figure, but it was in double figures.
It's like 120.
Yeah, and I was quite surprised that there's that many parks, in Manchester. And I think one of the things we could do is encourage people to use those green spaces and encourage communities and community events to happen in those green spaces, because then we'll get more people actually using them, knowing they're there, knowing that they are public spaces that we can use, not just probably walk through or walk around or just to walk the dog. I think there's lots of other community stuff that we can do in those community open green spaces.
Yeah, it's
I'm
how
really-
accessible and legible they are. Yeah, go on.
Yeah,
I'm really interested in what happens when it rains in Manchester. We all talk about the importance of green spaces, and are important for all kinds of reasons. Obviously, being around trees and nature and learning about the natural world and the natural environment is incredibly important. But some of the most important aspects of urban civic life happen in these green spaces, and in a really democratic way. Like, people just come and use these green spaces in whatever way feels right to them, and then they're not. There's nobody governing them. But in Manchester, in most cities in Northern Europe, it rains half of the year. So if we all agree that these sorts of really valuable activities should happen in parks, and we're all on the same page that there should be these green spaces, what happens in winter months? What happens when it gets dark? What happens when it rains? Like, where does that activity go?
Stephen?
Yeah. It's high on the agenda in every city, I think, now. There's when you talk about green spaces, you also talk about biodiversity and health and well-being, because we know that people feel a lot better when they're surrounded by green, and the idea of exercise, being in these environments. So it's a win-win situation if you actually invest in these areas. And now we have the climate agenda, which is a burning platform. We are introducing climate projects all over our city, where we're introducing water and green planning to SUD proposals for SUDs and things. So it's going to have to come anyway. And I think it also means that we have to reduce the amount of tar macadam in the city and this whole problem of heat islands. So there's a whole series of sustainable things going on here which we have to address.
Yeah.
And I did walk around. I'm staying at the McDonald at Piccadilly. And I thought I'd try and find this place in advance so I don't get lost. And I said, I'll just follow the quickest route I could get here. So I went through the university campus. And it was, why does the engineering faculty have to be the ugliest one on the faculty? Why is that? It's just roads, it's back streets, it's I was thinking about livability, and I thought there's no livability here whatsoever. And there's the Mancunian motorway I had to traverse.
Mancunian Way, yeah.
And there was just asphalt, and I thought if you looked at the footprints of the buildings and how much asphalt there is, tar macadam, there's a ratio of about 80% asphalt to the building. And I thought you could make this like 25% asphalt and 75% green. Because I thought, something's got to happen because it's designed by highway engineers. It's not being designed by urbanists or landscape. And it's just a thing that came after the post-war, right?
Yeah.
The city's designed around traffic. So this whole agenda facing us now, the climate and the green and the health and well-being of the citizens, children, the elderly, and just everyday life, we have to take that more seriously because we're going to get sick of it.
With all that asphalt around, just have to remind you that Manchester is the most livable city in the UK, according to The Economist. But
not on that route I walked.
No, exactly. but it begs the question about how are those decisions made and what is it actually really measuring, Joe?
I think the only thing I would add to what's been said by the panel so far is that for me, in terms of unlocking that green space, there are two scales of action that are required, and one is the strategic scale. So we've talked about Mancunian Way already. So it's to do with severance, and it's to do with unlocking spaces and connecting spaces together so they're more usable, so that there are a series of loops that people can run, they can walk, they can cycle, all of those sorts of things which support health and well-being centrally within cities. So there's the strategic unlocking of that severance, and the severance between communities too, which has a sort of, there's a whole other agenda wrapped around that, but that's incredibly important. So physical severance is a really big problem in terms of actually stitching spaces together that people can use on street, and therefore how you then can introduce green spaces or connect existing green spaces and make sure, as you've been describing, that they're programmed and active and people feel able to use them. So there's those things. There's the miles and the kilometres and those big scale things, and then there's the millimetres. So it doesn't take very much, actually, in design terms, to link green space with housing, with shops, with communities. It can be very small details that enable actually a place space to be really, really successful and connect to the community sitting around that place space. And it can be something as simple as the positioning of a tree or an unlocking of a gate, and very, very simple things about thresholds and relationships and overlooking and how safe a place feels. The other thing that I think we do need to address in Manchester, and is absolutely driving me mad currently with the project we have in Mars Platting, is that there is a huge discussion at strategic level about net zero carbon in Manchester, and an incredible ambition of the city to do more and better than any other city in this country. And yet I go to planning meetings on this project, and we're having to make an argument for why we haven't got 2 parking spaces per home on a site that it's a 20-minute walk from Piccadilly Station. Now, that's not right. So somehow, in terms of changing the thinking that's flowing from high-level strategic ambition and policy through to what's getting planning approval, that needs to be unlocked. So it's sort of all of those scales.
Okay. Pat?
picking up on that last point Joe's made, I was reminded of the song They Paved Paradise and put up a parking lot, because there's an awful lot of space in Manchester city centre that is tarmacked for cars, and I imagine a lot of them are actually development sites that are going to come forward. But to Joe's point about the council and speaking with forked tongue, you know, I don't see the evidence of leadership in the amount of development that has come forward in terms of a livability agenda, in terms of streetscape and greening in the area. It's very grey. I love Manchester. I'm a Liverpudlian, but I still love Manchester. And but it is a very grey city, and it's so easy to green it, as Joe and others have said. In New York, Bloomberg followed the lead that we had in Central London Partnership, where we wanted to both wanted to make the cities livable, to keep talent there, to attract talent. And one of the things that Bloomberg did in his Greater Green and New York plan was mandate that no New Yorker would live more than 10 minutes away from some green space and some open space. And they did an inquiry very quickly. They mapped where the green space was against where the sort of the different levels of income. And they started with the areas which had the most significant or the least green space and the highest needs and deprivation. And that's where they started to create the parks and open spaces, as well as plant 1 million trees in short order, and got the community to adopt those trees and plant them themselves. So I think it's really important in all of this to look to yourself. We heard from Ben earlier about agency, and everyone in this room has a responsibility or the potential to get involved in this. Go and plant a tree, go and agitate to turn a parking space into a piece of green space. And I would also just mention strategically and locally, there is now a mandate that's coming through the government's environment bill for developers to do net gain biodiversity plans. So any development has to make the biodiversity of that area better than when they started. And so that is something that the council will have to take very seriously, and therefore developers. And one developer that is taking that very seriously is U&I, who many of you will know is already planning a park, which Studio Egret West is designing in Mayfield. Yet I was horrified to read an article in the Manchester Evening Post saying, oh, it's going to cause antisocial behaviour, and it's going to just be places where people can have crime, and do we really need a park in the city centre? So let's get a vision and a grip if you want green space in Manchester.
It's a really good point that actually they're building a 6.5 acre park right next to Piccadilly Station, which is really a fantastic thing. But the interesting thing there about all of this is how much is top down and how much is bottom up. So how much as planners can you decide, that you want open and green space? How much do you want to liberate people to develop things? Because individual developers will not be taking, the spreadsheet won't be saying you want some open and green space in this particular spot. Is the problem with that, isn't it? So how do we get everybody working together? I think Mayfield is a really interesting example. It does need developers with vision working together with the city council, but it's kind of a small step, isn't it?
I think it all depends on city leadership. Really. And you'll see my talks next week. I always start with this thing about governance. It all depends on the will to do something. And I've got lots of different examples, but I think the major projects that we've ever achieved in Aarhus, we every 4 years have an election, and we've been able to continue working on these projects with like 30-year plans to achieve them. And I think we have a general consensus. We don't have a two-party system. We've got 8 parties as me in Aarhus. And this is a very important point. And one of the mantras in Aarhus is that we want to make a city that's good for everyone. And that means we have to have the citizens involved in everything we do. Yeah. So it's not top-down alone. It's the councillors, 31 councillors we have. Yeah. They are interested in making partnerships.
Yeah.
with the citizens, because our welfare cannot just exist by paying more and more tax. We have to support each other more and more and get people involved, empowered, to give them the capacity to do it.
I think these questions of governance and how we collaborate, maybe you can come back to that in a moment and take another question from the audience. And I would like to ask Malcolm Garrett. Where are you, Malcolm? Over there.
Yeah, we read a lot about the erosion of the high street and along with it, the disappearance of community centres. So what I'd like to hear is how important is community in the livable city, and what kind of communities are we providing for or accommodating?
So we're here shifting slightly. With the first question, we're really talking about people. You know, we're designing for people, and what is the role of people? What is the agency of individuals and so forth? But community, you know, in the 60s, you could say that some of the design that we did with big high-rise and so forth tore away old communities that had existed before. In the 80s, Margaret Thatcher kind of obliterated social housing. And now we're left here today with a real challenge in housing, affordable housing for people and so forth. Community is at the heart of all of these things. So how important is community in today? Ben?
Okay, well, I guess in Manchester at the moment, the pace of change has never been faster, has it? And it's becoming increasingly complex as a city, and we all know that development leaves people behind. And any way that we can stop people feeling isolated has got to be a good thing. From our perspective, that the city is being developed really, really quickly, and there's nothing to support new places for communities to assemble, non-transactional community spaces, and we'd be really keen to try to find routes to providing more of these. We know that they're on the decline. Our towns used to be built around churches. We used to have churches in the middle of every town, and whilst we're no longer a religious society, perhaps a secular church type of building might be an appropriate thing. Perhaps that has been replaced by something else entirely that we don't yet know of. You know, perhaps in some communities, a boxing gym performs the same function, or a post office can perform the same function. But these places where communities assemble and are allowed to congregate in a non-transactional way need to be supported. Otherwise, we're definitely at risk of leaving people behind by the pace of change. One final thing on the participation front as well. We did talk a lot when we're only a small young agency that's feeling our way through this really complicated process of trying to build cities and help communities find agency. And we used to talk a lot, having read a book by Jane Jacobs about cities being better when everybody's involved in building them, and we used to bang on about that quite a lot. But I've suddenly, over the last few months, started to think that everyone's quite busy. Everyone's got very, very busy lives. And whilst we should be encouraging members of the public to participate in a city, which shouldn't be on the average Joe to find time to attend town planning meetings or to build a park for themselves. This needs to be centrally organised. And I think instead of encouraging people to participate in the building of cities, we should be encouraging more civic ownership over places. So we're not reliant on citizens being well behaved and well mannered. That we're looking for citizens to be owners of the city that they live in.
Yeah, so they have ownership of it, and that determines their role in it as well then. So that's very interesting. Now, Malcolm, apart from talking about community, of course, also mentioned High Street. Now, in Greater Manchester, we have Bolton, and we have Rochdale and Bury and Lee and Stockport, all these different places. What's the importance of High Street going forward, Joe?
Well, it's really interesting because a project, again, I'm working with Pat on this project, but we're working in a part of East London in Poplar where, talking about churches being eroded, actually all the pubs have been eroded. And there is one historic high street which is pretty sort of derelict in certain points and sort of empty, that was built at the time, just after the Festival of Britain. There was a lot of bomb damage. The whole site used to be, it was Victorian terraces, very tight sort of density. And on every corner, or on lots of the corners of each of the streets, were pubs, and they were wiped away with development in the sort of post-Festival of Britain era. And there were a couple of beautiful Festival of Britain churches built, but there weren't any pubs. And so on the high street, actually the community have campaigned with a group of artists to reinstate the pub on this high street. And it's the most popular social space on that high street. There's no community centre yet, there will be. And we're working with Assemble to design one. But at the moment there's no community centre, and there's one that is sort of very underused and has a sort of very difficult threshold that lots of members of the community don't want to enter. So the high street is actually at the moment being transformed by this pub as a new sense of sort of new community centre. And then we are reinstating a series of meanwhile uses along the high street to sort of test what's going to last and what's going to work there in terms of what that new high street might be. So it's really evolving at quite a fast pace because there's lots of new housing being built in that area, and so the community, the demographics of the area are changing really, really rapidly. You know, it's sort of 15,000 new people moving into that part of London. So in terms of what's the future of the high street, well, there have been many panel debates on that over the last few years. But I think it's really important, as with housing, for there to be flex. And because we don't really know what the future of retail is, for example. And Pat, coming back to the sort of supermarket and the idea of a Tesco Metro on every corner, well, that certainly isn't going to be the future. And what we're planning for on this particular high street, for this particular community, is a high street that has a degree of flexibility and a sort of different modes of some activities will be there for a year, some may well be there for 10 years. And as Ben has just beautifully described, we're trying to create some clearings in that high street for the community to come together.
So, Arima, what is the reality of this in South Manchester with community centres and high streets?
Yeah, community centres are really important spaces and places because we have a few community centres which are still operating, the West Indian Sports and Social Club. There's another one, another Caribbean club that's really important to, you know, community. However, what has happened is, even though that's been there for well before I was even born, so it's been there for years, but obviously blocks of flats have built up around it, even though they're mainly student accommodation, and now the centre's being told, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that because of noise, but they were there first, and but the community have campaigned and said, we're keeping it, because it's where people come, it's where people meet, it's where they can discuss things if they want. Lots of different people can use the spaces. And I think they're very key spaces as well. And inside those spaces, because even things like libraries have closed, you know, lots of libraries have closed. And they were spaces where people could go and sit down and relax and, you know, have a talk. But even the local ones of those have closed, you know, in Fallowfield, because that's the one I used to use a lot, but that's gone. But even though they've changed the space now into a community space where people can go and do lots of other types of community events. And I think those spaces are important because without those, you don't have a community. Yes, communities are changing, but whatever the community is, because I used to always have a question as what is the community? Because people used to say, oh, you represent the community. And I used to say, well, who are the community? You know, who are the community? what is the community? And I think it's those people that live in that particular neighborhood, that particular area, they are going to want to come together at some point, even if it's on the high street. I mean, we've kept our Hume High Street, even though that's not what it was called originally, because it is actually in Moss Side. Don't know why they call it Hume. But again, the high street is really important because there's certain things you can get on your high street. I know I couldn't go to Marks and Spencer and get my yam and my plantain. I just wouldn't be able to get it in Marks and Spencer or Tesco, you know, just wouldn't be able to. Asda's trying, you know, they are trying. But the high street, again, is really important because you get to know the local owners. They get to know you. You can have other, I mean, the amount of conversations that happen in our local shops, you know, even about Brexit and politics and everything, you still have all those, you know, conversations because people know each other, that they are, the high street, it is a meeting place that people have. And I also think, as you were both talking, you know, who's actually making these decisions to close the libraries and close the pubs and close the, what else was there, the churches? Who's making those decisions? And whoever's making those decisions obviously don't live within a community, or they can't see the fact that communities are important. They probably want us to go back to blocks of flats. And something else I've heard recently in South Manchester, what people are saying, they're using the word, you know, gentrification, you know, that they're moving all of us out to put all these posh things up, you know, where they, even though like in Hume, yes, they got rid of the bull rings, but people were told they will get the first option to buy the new properties that they were building. But guess what? Can't afford them. Just can't afford them. So those people never ever move back in, but they still come to the high street because they still need to get their stuff. But the high street is really, really important. I think what that does, it does pull people together. You know, it does. And whoever's making the decisions, like you mentioned, leadership, obviously they don't see that. You know, they obviously don't see that. Otherwise, we would not be closing all these things that actually bring people together. And yes, Manchester's changing. We boast about multicultural Manchester. So we know it's changing. We know it's changing, I mean, people-wise, we know it's changing for the good. So therefore, we need to keep those spaces that bring all those people together rather than let those people live in isolation in their own little, if we want to call community. You know, you've got the Jewish community lives over there, the African community stay over there, and this community stay over there. We need to have those spaces that bring them together, you know, because we boast and talk about multiculturalism, but how many of us actually do it? How many spaces are there to even encourage people to actually do that?
Well, we want places to regenerate, we want them to develop, but how can we do that in a way that works for the communities? I know in London, in Elephant and Castle, for example, there was a lot of controversy about the communities that were living there when development was thought about. So how can we address these things, Pat?
I don't know. It's so hard. I've a couple of thoughts, but to pick up your point about, you know, the pluralism. This is not community, it's communities. And communities bind round often, you know, particular interest, and frequently they're communities when you've got kids of the same age. And it goes back to green space, doesn't it? And, you know, the importance of places which help people congregate. And to Ben's point about non-transactional approaches, I think that's so important because quite often, you know, the experience in saving the high street, we now look to what we call the experience economy, for God's sake. And, you know, the experience economy is how do we go into a place and experience something which is not just shopping, but that's excluding, and I will get to Elephant and Castle, I promise you, but via King's Cross, you know, some reports, some work that was done in King's Cross was looking at how excluding the type of stores are in King's Cross. They say, you know, not for me, these stores are for very rich people. And whilst the public realm is beautiful, actually stepping over the doorstep of a high-end baker or a high-end coffee shop is something that is very excluding to people. So I think it does come down to diversity, and that goes back to what I was alluding to earlier, which is diversity of thought when we're planning these places. So we are thinking about different people's needs. And then to add to that, the complexity in a place like Manchester, like Central London Partnerships, remit for Central London, you've got workers and and students and a whole host of people which form a community as well that have to be bound in. And at the heart of this, even if you want occasionally be negative about them, are planners actually trying to plan for this city that is for everybody really, and that's the complexity of cities. In New York, there's a high street, and picking up on the gentrification point, we were having a conversation about gentrification and how places gentrify and get more expensive. The poorer community become completely invisible. And one bid manager, business improvement district manager for a place in Brooklyn, Myrtle Avenue, said that she never sees her poorer community anymore because the shops that they once used to use and the services that they once used to use have been replaced by the hipster coffee shops, and they simply don't have a need to go to the high street. And as has already been demonstrated, these places are absolutely fundamental backbones of not just people's community, but their mental well-being and absolute sort of safety net and link with other people. There's a great report which I'd urge you to look at, which was done for the Greater London Authority by a company called We Made That, and it was looking in detail at 3 different high streets and what they were for, and people were asked, what do you want from your high street? And it was an open question, and there were about 80 or 90 different responses. So it isn't just a loaf of bread or batteries for something. It's a whole plethora of things that, and for so many people, exactly the point that's already been illustrated, it's a point where people simply go to have conversation. So I think we have to think in terms of our community centres as being the thriving places that we're talking about today, which makes livability. And how you orchestrate that means we all have to, even in a time-stressed way, sort of put our heads above the parapet occasionally and say, well, what about, don't forget this. So in Elephant and Castle, just to pick up the point, Casper, I chair something called the Elephant and Castle Partnership. It represents the institutions and the developers that are rebuilding, redeveloping, and some would say regenerating Elephant and Castle. And it's at the heart of a debate about people being taken out of council estates and like Hume, not being able to afford to come back. It is also, though, at the heart of a debate of one of the problems that we face in our built environment world, which is there's a lot of mythology about what actually goes on in planning and development. Because what Southwark Council did before they knocked down the Haygate estate, which was 1,100 homes, some of which were actually owner occupied. So there were 650 units, families that needed to be rehoused, which was social housing. And they built pretty much the equivalent of those number of homes quite locally. And they invited people to come back to them. 98% of people who left the Haygate estate have been rehoused within 3 miles of the Elephant and Castle. But if you read The Guardian and Ollie Wainwright, they've all been shipped to Outer Mongolia because because people want to believe a small group of community activists who are campaigning against the development. So I'm sorry, I've gone on for too long, but my final point in all of this is we want to have debate, have places to understand, and actually simply talk and think about what we want our future to be. And then if some people want to take that on further and get involved in community planning, so be it. But let's just have a conversation.
Choices do have to be made as we move forward, and you can't always please everybody all the time, obviously. So it's interesting to understand the dynamics. Now, gentrification, does that have a resonance for you in Aarhus and Aalborg? And is it actually something that is in opposition to community, or can it go together?
That's a really big question, that one. You twisted it in the end there. If gentrification is here to stay, unfortunately, some people say it's bad, some people say it's good. I've studied this quite a lot over the last 20 years, also at the Architect School in New York and London and different places. And I think one of the challenges facing us for the high street is very serious, because we haven't got our head around e-shopping yet. We don't really fully understand the consequences of it. We see things happening. It could be something that could be really interesting, but we have to rethink all these different things now. We're in an age of change. You can either embrace it or react against it. And there's a definite tendency that people are nervous about what's happening. A good reason, I think. But we have to be able to frame what's going on and study it. And I'm doing a Master of Science at the London School of Economics in cities and the last 2 years. And I think it's very interesting to study this, gathering evidence, facts about what's going on and measuring it, things like this. And I think you work with these statistics, I know Gail's office does, and gathering information. And one of the things I've studied is Susanna Hall, who's done this fantastic PhD project some years ago at the LSE about the high street. And did a study, a sociological, anthropological study of these streets and how they're reinventing themselves. And I was very fascinated because there's, I think it was in Lewisham, this one high street, how the shops have changed use. And they did a mapping of one of these shops, and you have, I think, it's not pop-up shops, but there's in one floor plate you have 8 or 9 different shops. You rent a table. You can do nails, you know, or you can have an iPhone repair shop at the front. It's very expensive. And the further you go back, the cheaper it is. And there's a whole series of things happening on this front. And one of the biggest problems has been the multinational companies, you know, on the high streets. And they're closing down or moving and leaving these spaces. But perhaps it's an opportunity. Because I was, you know, having gone through the backyards of the campus, I was thrilled to walk across a park just up the road here and bump into Hatch.
Yes.
Underneath the motorway, the Mancunian motorway there. And I thought, this is really excellent, because you have to have this grittiness. And I'm wondering whether or not this reinventing, it all depends on the level of rent you're having to pay. Who's going to pay for that massive rent in Square One, or One Square, whatever it's called? Who are the people?
Circle Square.
Circle Square, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Circle Square.
Yeah.
I was looking at that project there, I thought, this is really gentrification. I walked a little bit further up. There's all these beautiful brick buildings from the Victorian period along the canals, and these generic office buildings being pumped up like mad. And I'm just wondering what's going to be in the ground floor. Which shops are going to go in there? That's really gentrification that's, you know, I'm worried about.
I mean, it's mainly large institutions, isn't it, that are basically going to be taking
Is
that?
it just
It's
is
largely
it
it's
university?
universities. It's essentially, yes, it's the corridor
Yeah.
investment. But yes, what
But
will be the activation? What will be the yeah?
You know, and I thought I need to get an adapter. I've got 10 adapters at home, you know, and I forgot them. And I thought, where the hell do I find an adapter?
Yes.
And then there's one coffee shop after multinational after the other, and then there's a Boots, and they don't have one. And then luckily I found a pharmacy, an Indian shop, and they're open until midnight actually, and they had one. But those quirky shops, they're not really around in the middle of the city anymore. And that's a shame.
Indeed.
That's the downside of gentrification.
I just want to say you probably didn't go far enough. Curry Mile, you've got all those shops. You'll find everything. They sell everything and anything. The other half of Oxford, the proper half of Oxford Road. Yeah, yeah, where people live. Not this side, the other side.
Are there any questions from the audience about the high street, the community? If you have any thoughts, raise your hand. Yes? Hang on.
I guess it was about how big a neighborhood is. And I was thinking about this because of what you said about people who were relocated to 3 miles away. And if I relocated 3 miles away, I wouldn't be able to see any of my mates in the pub anymore because they're just around the corner. All the people that I hang out with, they live within at least a mile, probably no more than a mile. In fact, I've got a friend who lives in North Manchester who's probably like 4 miles away. And I generally see her about once a year socially because she's got kids, I've got kids. We're both really busy. So 3 miles away is a huge distance. I see friends who I've got in Turkey, which isn't quite as far as Azerbaijan, but it's like a long way away, as often as I see friends who are living 3 miles away. So I was just thinking about the kind of the walkability of a neighborhood or how big people think a neighborhood is.
It's a really good question. What is a neighborhood?
It's a really important question. I think what I was summarising a lot more detail on the Elephant and Castle case because people were moved out of the Haygate and in many cases they were housed in what they could be called temporary accommodation, as in, good quality social homes. They could come back, they could make a choice when the Haygate was rebuilt, when the Lend-Lease scheme was finished. People could make a choice to come back. So people were given choices to where they go. Some of them were within spitting distance of where they used to live, quite a lot of them. Some of them were, they were different distances. Some of them went to south of the borough in Dulwich. Most people that relocated have made choices whether they're going to come back or not. In fact, all of them have made choices whether to stay where they moved to or come back. And the point is there were choices, but they were not sent to Gravesend and Margate, which is what the press have been saying. But to your wider point is what is a community? You're absolutely right. It's the critical thing. But living in London really tests the notion of what is a community because it's an expensive place to live. People have to make choices dependent on schools, and you're constantly, and all sorts of things like transport for work. And we're constantly having our notion of what is a neighbourhood stretched, because of all of those things, really.
On that note, I'm going to segue in a different direction and go to the next question, and that's coming from Otis Valentine.
For many people, cars are an essential part of livability in Greater Manchester. In what ways will transport and mobility have to change in the future livable city?
Cars, Greater Manchester, you can't just do without them, can you? Because there's a lot of space to cover and people have to get to work and they have to get to play. Yeah. How do we actually change that dynamic?
Can I jump in on this one? This is a major concern in relationship to CO2 and the environment. And if you, in Aarhus, we're planning on trying to achieve CO2 neutrality by 2030. We're finding that's going to be difficult. And one of the biggest challenges is the car. And we've got people, I think 5,000 new citizens in Aarhus every year, and they're driving in and out. And I think if you took that as a point of departure and say that's a burning platform, we have to readdress mobility. Simple as that. And there's congestion charges. I think London's doing a very good job. They're doing some, well, they have been, in terms of NOx and levels, because extending the congestion distance further out, and the reduction of diesel fumes and things like this. I just think we have to readdress it and try and get people to move either to walk, cycle, or public transport. And we have to have park and ride or whatever on the outskirts and come in public transport. That means you have to invest in public transport, and it has to be electric.
It's very interesting because...
and it has to be free.
It has to be
electric.
No, I mean,
just go the whole hog.
Go the whole hog. I mean, Manchester has committed to zero carbon by 2038, which is the most ambitious target of any city in the country, and how are we going to do it? Obviously, this has got to be part of it. So, Pat, how are we going to do it?
Exeter are going for 2030, so I think there's going to be inflation on everybody's ambitions, which would be a good thing, wouldn't it, if we were ambitious in that? I think it's so complex. I think of it as we took them up to the top of the hill and we walked them down again, is the nursery rhyme that goes through my mind. Because in the 20th century, we wrapped our minds around cars and fossil fuels and plastic, and we all sort of developed ourselves to live a life based on those things. And now we're going to have to walk back down again without those things, and we've got to work out urgently how we're going to do it. I worry about things like the talk about awesome AVs and electric cars, because I think that's a get out of jail card, and we have to really be thinking about mass transit and using public transport, but using public transport in a way that goes back to the way we live our lives and understanding how we live our lives. So my big thing for the future of London, Joe, is we need bloody big bus stops, because actually if it's raining as much as it is in London and Manchester and everywhere these days, and we've all got to wait for buses, let's make waiting for buses at least dry and warm, so we will be prepared to leave our cars behind. So we have to give people carrots as well as the sticks, and we have to invest. And it's great what Andy Burnham's doing here, the effort he's put into, trying to get your bus service into the same sort of state that London's was. London's bus service is unravelling, unfortunately, for all sorts of reasons. But we have to invest in public transport and then build platforms like mobility as a service. But your question was also about other wider mobility as well, and there's a whole range of things in that. But let's start from, how does the average person move? Not a young man who's very content to get an electric scooter and think that is the solution to our urban transport problem.
And cause everybody else problems on the road. I think, but the point that Otis was making is that cars at the moment are an essential part of livability in Greater Manchester for many people. A carless city centre, maybe? What do you think?
I think we've already got a carless city centre. There's not many places you can drive through the city. I mean, Oxford Road, for example, you can't drive down Oxford Road until after 9 o'clock. You can't drive down. But what I was going to say was, yes, improve the transport system if you don't want people to drive, but then it shouldn't cost us heaven and earth to use that transport system. I mean, electric cars, I must admit, I had an electric car for 4 years because I thought, do my bit. And it was very affordable, and I think because the government, they put in X amount for people, as like you say, the carrot, but they've more than taken that carrot away and they're beating me with the stick now. And I say that because, yes, we had an electric car, and it was a good deal because then, you don't have any road tax to pay. You could park for free in the city centre as long as you were charging, which is great. But then when the government have taken away that the benefit or whatever they called it that they gave people, the subsidy. I mean, we went to get another one, but it's like 4 times the price of what we were paying, before. It's gone up from like £100 a month to them being told we're going to have to pay £500 and odd pounds a month. And it's like, you can get cheaper cars, for that amount, which is what we've ended up doing. Well, and I think that's wrong, because if you want people to stop driving, whether the petrol or the diesel cars, and they want to, people to use the electric cars, they should offer the subsidies and continue to offer the subsidies, because that's the only way people are going to make the change, which is what we did. But now we've gone back, to a petrol, not necessarily to be able to drive into the city centre, because we don't drive into the city centre anyway. We get on a bus because you just can't drive around the city centre. So we get a bus anyway. But even the buses, I think, for example, if I take a bus in front of my house to the city centre, it costs something like, I think it's like £3 something. Whereas if I walk the 10 yards to Oxford Road, then it costs me £1.50. And I'm thinking, well, why does it cost that extra almost £2 just to go one bus stop. And it is literally one bus stop. So it's the things like that. If they want people to use the public transport, it has to be affordable, it has to be on time. And I don't understand why there's so many different buses and so many different companies, you know, so they do all different kinds of prices. And it's not only the students as well that use, you know, the buses, you know, in Manchester. They've got to think of everybody using that transport.
Okay, can I just cease there for a moment and hold a quick straw poll? What happened a number of years ago, after London introduced the congestion charge, somebody proposed that we should have it here in Manchester, and there was a public revolt. We weren't having it here, and so it didn't proceed. So I'd just like to ask in the audience, how many people think there should be a congestion charge in the city centre of Manchester now? If you think that, hold up your hand. And how many people think that would not be a good idea? Some people are brave enough to say no. And why don't you think that would be a good idea? Can I?
I think it's just the general frustration of, if you're working in the centre of Manchester, getting in to central Manchester, very often I would need a vehicle to get in there. I use the train, I've used trams. Parking is an issue. It is very expensive to bring your car into central Manchester, but I just need the flexibility to be able to drive around from development to development.
The essential point, public services, public transport, not good enough to do the job for you. You have to have a car. It's an essential part of livability. So, in other words, to have a congestion charge in central Manchester, you say, well, make it easy for me to travel in another way. Would you say that would be fair?
You'd have to have facilities to make it easier to get into and out of Manchester quickly. There are those facilities. The trams are excellent. It's very, very good.
That's true.
But if I want to drive in from the M60, it's not easy or convenient to find a park and ride to get in for 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning.
And the tram doesn't go to Lee and Bolton and all that. Anyway, Joe.
I think it is to do with affordability and accessibility, but I think it ultimately does come down to investment in public transport, obviously. The one thing I would also say is that what's really interesting in terms of how certain cities have transformed a kind of flow of cars within the urban grain. You know, Barcelona is an amazing example of actually the super block there, where they've greened certain blocks and created green space and shared space as a sort of as a trial to see how people would respond and react to that. And it's really interesting. That's stuck, and now that's part of Barcelona's morphology. And so it feels to me as though there need to be some really radical trials to show how space can be transformed if we take the car out, whether that's at the weekend, as in, you know, that's done monthly in Paris. There are major things happening in other cities that are just sort of testing out what's possible. And I think when people see the benefit, as long as it's happening alongside massive investment in transport infrastructure in terms of mass transit systems, then people don't want to go back.
Okay. A number of years ago, I have to be honest, it's actually a number of decades ago, both Malcolm Garrett, who's sitting over there, and I, we used to both travel into work in large American cars at one point. And I'm wondering, Ben, is this what you do? And if you're not driving a gas guzzler into work at the moment, does it mean that we can just rely on a generational shift to sort all our problems out?
Can you imagine me in a big American car? I can't drive. I don't know how to drive. I never learned. But I live in a city centre, and I'd like to return to that point, like making the city centre where people are trying to get to more livable, and livable for families is a really important part of this, surely. Like, obviously, massive improvements to the transport infrastructure have to take place, but if you don't need to use the transport infrastructure and you live where you work, which I do, that has to be part of the solution. I live in just on the outskirts of Ancoats at the moment, and I work in town, so I have 10 minutes to walk into the place I work. But we are starting to feel like now we've got a 2-year-old. Is the city centre a safe place to have a 2-year-old running around? Should we be making more efforts to make where you live a place that you can also work? I've got friends that run a cafe as well in the Northern Quarter, and they have to, they're normal people that are trying to run an independent business, but they have to live like a 30-minute commute into the city centre to operate their business because they can't afford to live where they work, which doesn't quite seem to make much sense. Like shop houses used to be a thing when I grew up in a little town in North Wales. My mates lived above the shops that their parents ran, and that's something that we don't see in city centres. And is that something that could happen again? I don't know. I don't know enough about the housing side of things, but it feels like a logical move.
Well, I think there's been a really fascinating discussion so far, but we have time. I don't want to eat into the time for drinking too much, and so we'll just take one more question from the floor, and that's from Sophie Huller.
Affordable and healthy housing suited to people's needs is one of the biggest challenges and key to livability. So how can we tackle that in a good and sustainable way?
Housing for all. Joe, maybe you'd like to speak to that.
Well, as you can imagine, it's something I feel very strongly about, and it's a really good question. I mentioned it earlier. I think one aspect is flexibility. I think I really deeply worry about how siloed the provision of housing has become in this country. There are lots of historic reasons for that, tracking back to before the Thatcher era and Right to Buy. But we find ourselves in the position now of designing housing for very, very specific people. And it's a real problem. And it means that communities quite often, the word community comes up again, but get fragmented because people can't, not only in terms of affordability, but in terms of space, can't stay where they're trying to raise children or where they're growing old. So I think one thing is to think about our housing provision differently. We should be designing good housing, not good social housing, good private housing, good student housing, good housing for the elderly. We should just be designing good housing. And that has got lost in the structure of how housing has become financed in the last 15, 20 years. Or slightly longer, last 30 years. And so I think we have to come back to a time when we're designing flexible housing that has capacity to adapt to the households that are living in that housing over a very long period. And I won't be the first architect to talk about the flexibility and wonder of the Georgian house and how wonderfully that can adapt into flats. It can go back to one household living in it. But part of the wonder of a Georgian house is because it was designed with that flex in mind. And we have got so siloed in terms of the delivery of our housing that somehow isn't possible. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't scrutinise every millimetre in our housing and make the most out of everything. I think quite often we don't look at the section as much as we should look at the plan when we're designing housing and think about volumetrically what space volumetrically can offer, as well as how big that home might be. So I think all of those things come to play in terms of sort of radically rethinking our design of housing and who it's for and over what period, and imagining, wouldn't it be wonderful in a planning system where we put a planning application in and we have to show how that housing flexes over the next 50 years, and we show how actually that housing might become a shop, or it might become 2 flats merge into one to provide a home for a bigger household, and then that merge into housing for an older person with a carer or with space for their grandchildren to visit. So I think there has to be a really big shift in terms of not only the design of housing, but also how it's viewed, how it's appraised, and how it's valued. Sorry, I don't know if that's answering the question.
I think it's giving a great insight, I would say, Joe. So affordable good quality housing for all. Stephen, do you in Aarhus face the same challenges that we face here?
Exactly the same. The price of the land is extortionate in the inner city, forcing people out. We have a national law that says we have to have 25%, up to 25% of housing has to be affordable housing. We have an extensive housing association system in Denmark, non-profitable housing organizations. But I was recently in Madrid and visited some social housing being made there by the council. They're investing quite a lot in this at the moment because of big problems, waiting lists. And they make their housing so that it is maximum 30% of their wage level. And think about that. This is the OECD's model. It should be like that for everyone. If you make housing available for everyone, it should be maximum 30% of your income. And they adjust it to the people on the list. You could be unemployed, so you have your 30% of that. And I thought this is a social system that works. And when you talk about affordability, this is, what level? And I think it's a very good idea to work with 30%. We don't do that in Denmark. But I think it could be a model we could work more and more with. Especially when it's, if you're on the property ladder, it's a lot easier. But if you're renting, it's a mind-boggling challenge. It's food to mouth. It's a terrible life.
So affordable housing,
livelihood.
Pat, I think affordable housing has been seen as the solution in big developments to provide people with housing. What's the future of that, of affordability in housing as part of developments and social housing? What's the future of that, do we think?
It's a broken model because, it's our most basic human need, in the bottom, right at the bottom of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we've actually made it the responsibility of private developers, and then we beat them over the head for giving us some of our most important asset. It's a bit like transport. We just need to invest in housing. We need to invest in social housing, which is truly affordable. And for me, that is council housing. Isn't it fantastic that the Sterling Prize winner this year was a passive house council housing block? But there's 100 of them, and these places now apparently are being poured over by Uncle Tom Cobley and all, and they're having to restrict the number of visitors that are going around. Wouldn't it be wonderful if that was the norm as opposed to something that was prize-worthy and visitor-worthy? And, everything, you talked about leadership right at the start and governance, and everything comes to leadership and vision, and we need to demand more as a society. Paul Finch, the journalist and commentator, said on a panel I was on several years ago, nobody walks into a baker's and says, is 50% of your loaves affordable? Is 50% of those cars you're selling affordable? So why do we actually make our developers who are building things give us our affordable homes? And this is having really poor outcomes in our built environment and what we're talking about in terms of livability. Because when you have to provide social housing as part of your development, you build bigger, you build denser, you make bad sort of choices about quality of architecture because of viability issues. So we're not getting the places we deserve because we're trying to cram too much. And add to that, the community infrastructure levy, Section 106, paying for schools and homes and transport, and the Northern Line ticket hall, which the Delancey scheme in Elephant and Castle is going to pay for. And as a consequence, we're not getting the right type of housing that Joe is talking in the right places because it's where the market can provide it, not where we need it.
Well, yes. So I think we're raising a big question mark over market solutions being the way to go with this. Erinma, affordable housing, what's the future of it?
I think the question is, it's what is affordable, and I think that affordability goes back to the people that are designing it and the people that are sitting around the decision-making table in the first place. Because I've just been thinking, while everybody's been talking all along, that I don't know, maybe in your town planning meetings or design architecture meetings, do you actually have ordinary people there that are not planners or designers or architects, who are likely to be living in these places? Because maybe if you hear from their voices or hear from them, that could actually change, what we consider to be affordable. I liked what you said about adaptable, because I like the fact, when you said, I think housing should just be housing, for anybody to live in. I think if we continue to, because you listed, so if we continue to build for students, student housing, social housing, elderly housing, that is what we will continue to do, and it will continue not to serve, all people. And there'll be, again, I think what that does as well, it will continue to isolate certain people, because you live in council housing, so you're over there. You can't live in, the expensive housing because you're a council person. So I think really we should just build good housing for everybody and anybody, and if we have that in mind, that this housing, you mentioned about, did you say Georgian or Victorian? Georgian. Because I think we live in one of those, and it is very adaptable. We've changed ours so many different times, but it is just, one family that we're living in that. And I think if we build housing that is adaptable, and it's just housing that any of us would like to live in, I think that's the way to go. Adaptable housing will then be affordable, rather than, I think we build houses in isolation, and therefore people live in isolation. I think that is what the future is going to be if we continue to say we're building affordable housing, because I think the question is, affordable for who?
Yeah, so it's back to the future. I think when we have conversations about Manchester, we so often talk about the fact that Manchester's heritage and Manchester's history holds the key to Manchester's future. Maybe that's true as far as housing is concerned as well. But in a way, we're back to where we came in, which is about talking about designing with the community. But Ben, it's partly about designing with the community. It's also a question of scale, the scale on which decisions get made, maybe. About housing. How do we make decisions about making housing right for the communities and the people that live in them?
I don't think I can add anything to what you were just saying. That is exactly right, that housing should be built in consultation with the people that are going to live there. That seems very, very sensible. And we should not be building silos of different sorts of people in different sorts of places around the city. I think I honestly don't have anything to add to that.
Designing with the community, I think that is, well, there's a question over here. Yeah, Jonathan? Great, thanks. Over here.
Hello, I'm Shannon. The question that I had is, when the majority of homes that are being built currently are by private home builders that only care about the bottom line, how do you actually ensure good housing?
Spreadsheet development. How does that work in housing? Joe, do you have a view on that?
Can you repeat the end of the question?
Can you repeat the end of your?
When the majority of houses that are currently being built are by private home builders that only care about the bottom line, how do we actually ensure good homes are being built, communities are being built, because really that's not what they're thinking about?
No, it's a really good question. It's something we're all, probably everybody on this panel is struggling with in one way or another, whether you're working with a community that's working on a community centre, but it's part of a big regeneration project that's being partly delivered by a private developer. It's really tough. I think well, what's happening in London, I wanted to mention the fact that in terms of estate regeneration now, because of the mayor, each estate regeneration project that's happening in London has to go to the ballot. And that means that a local community have to vote for wholesale regeneration of those sites. Now, we can talk about sites outside London and national house builders, and that's a slightly different conversation. But if we're just talking about regeneration projects for a moment, I think that offers a community an enormous moment and voice to to control or certainly shape the type of development that's happening in their neighbourhoods. And alongside that goes the type of housing that's being delivered as part of that. And Ben, as you were saying, it does mean a huge amount of investment of personal time of those members of the community. And we work with many hundreds, and if not thousands, of community members across lots of different estates, and have done for a long time, who have invested 10 years worth of their lives in shaping their communities. But I certainly think that the legislation that's forcing the ballot may well have a very positive approach in terms of the shape of our housing to come. I certainly hope so. So there is lots of stick there rather than carrot. But in terms of what's happening outside metropolitan spaces and what's being delivered by house builders, I think that is a wholly different question and a real problem, because our experience of that is that there's a lot of housing being kind of smeared across the country that never has an architect anywhere near those projects, and is certainly not developed with a community looking at the type of housing that they might want to invest in and live in. So I think there is lots of work to do in terms of campaigning, in terms of highlighting the good and illustrating where things are delivered well and do suit a community. And that's sort of part of Caspar mentioned the book earlier, and that was about sort of highlighting good examples and so shining a light on what works. That's
a brilliant housing design handbook, by the way. Pat?
I want to go back to leadership and governance. And, there's a lot of conversations going on at the moment about design and creating good places. It's great we've got this debate. I'd love for us never to have this debate ever again, because we just do these things as opposed to have to talk about how we're going to make livable cities. But so across the country, the MHCLG, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, have been doing events about design. There is actually a chief architect in the government who's actually part-time. There's a variety of things going on. But what's happening is in local authorities right across the country, because of austerity, because of adult social care budgets absolutely sucking out all of the spare money that local authorities have, cuts are being made. And one of the places that these are being made to are planning authorities, urban designers, and whole levels of opportunities to think and to create in a really positive way are being stripped out. So what the architect Terry Farrell has always said, a place needs a client. You need to be a good client to create the right conditions for good to come out of it. And in the schemes that Joe's talking about especially, you really need a local authority with some leadership and vision to say, we will allow you to build here, but we want you, and we compel you to build well. And we need to fund our local authorities and get the right resources in so they can have the capacity to be the client for our places.
So I think what we're really saying is that when we want to develop livable cities, we want to develop cities that are good for the people who live in them and that are good for the planet as well. That's one thing we have to do. We have to actually think about the people who live. Live is about the people who live. That's the point that you made, Arima, at the beginning. The people who actually live in the city, and we have to put them first. And that actually is, as you were saying, Ben, it is about giving people agency in the things that are done and the way we do things. We like to say in Manchester we do things differently. Well, the way we do things differently should be actually about the people that are affected by it. I think I'm going to have to draw a line because we have gone way over our allotted time. So what I'd like to do is thank our panel very, very much for a really exciting and very interesting discussion about livability. Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed.